Imagine settling into your bed as the day begins to fade away, your breathing starting to slow, your muscles beginning to release the tension they've been holding. Feel the weight of your body sinking into the mattress beneath you, the gentle support it provides. Notice how your shoulders drop just a little bit more with each exhale, how your jaw unclenches, how the tiny muscles around your eyes soften and relax. Tonight, we're going on a journey together, back through thousands of years, to a civilization that has fascinated humanity for generations. We're traveling to ancient Egypt, but not to explore pyramids or decipher hieroglyphics in the way you might expect. Tonight, we're going to explore something far more intimate, far more universal, something that connects us across the vast gulf of time to people who lived along the Nile River more than 3,000 years ago. We're going to explore how they slept. Take a moment to get completely comfortable. Adjust your pillow to exactly the right height. Pull your blankets up or push them down to find that perfect temperature where you're neither too warm nor too cool. Let your legs settle into whatever position feels most natural and restful. Close your eyes if you haven't already, or if you prefer to keep them open, let your gaze soften and unfocus, looking at nothing in particular. This is your time, your space, your moment to let go of everything the day has demanded of you. Sleep is one of those beautiful universal experiences that every human being shares, regardless of when or where they lived. The ancient Egyptians needed sleep just as we do. They struggled with insomnia just as we do. They had nightmares and peaceful dreams. They sought ways to improve their rest, to protect themselves during those vulnerable hours of unconsciousness, to wake refreshed and ready for a new day. But the way they thought about sleep, the meaning they found in it, the rules and preferences they developed around it, these reveal a worldview so different from our own that it's almost like visiting an alien planet. And that's what makes this such a perfect story for drifting off to sleep. It's familiar enough to be comforting but strange enough to occupy your mind gently, keeping you from ruminating on tomorrow's worries while allowing you to gradually sink into rest. You've probably seen the title of this video and wondered about this idea of ancient Egyptians banning certain sleep positions. Let me be honest with you right from the start, because honesty is important even in stories meant to lull you to sleep. There's no evidence of official bans or laws prohibiting people from sleeping in certain positions. The ancient Egyptians didn't have sleep police checking how people positioned themselves at night. But what they did have was a complex set of beliefs, preferences, and practices around sleep that were deeply intertwined with their religion, their medicine, and their understanding of the cosmos. Some positions were strongly preferred. Others were likely avoided, not because they were illegal, but because they were thought to be spiritually dangerous or physically unhealthy. And understanding why they felt this way opens a window into how they saw the world, how they understood the human soul, and how they related to the mysterious realm of dreams. So get comfortable now. Adjust your pillow, pull your blanket up to that perfect level where you're neither too warm nor too cool. Let your body sink into your mattress. And let's begin our journey back to the banks of the Nile, where the sun blazes during the day but the nights can be surprisingly cool, where the rhythm of life was dictated by the river's annual flooding, where gods walked among humans in the minds of the people, and where sleep was not just a biological necessity but a spiritual journey that required careful attention and protection. The ancient Egyptians saw sleep very differently than we do in our modern world. For us, sleep is primarily about rest and recovery. We understand it through neuroscience and biology. We know about REM cycles and circadian rhythms. We think of it as our brain doing maintenance work, consolidating memories, clearing out metabolic waste. It's fundamentally a physical process, even if we acknowledge its importance for mental health. But for the ancient Egyptians, sleep was something far more profound and potentially dangerous. It was a time when the boundaries between the living world and the realm of the dead became thin and permeable. It was when the soul could slip away from the body and travel to other realms. It was when gods and spirits could communicate with humans, and when humans were most vulnerable to malevolent forces. To understand this, we need to talk about the Egyptian conception of the self. In our modern Western culture, we tend to think of ourselves as having a body and a mind or soul, a basic dualism. But the ancient Egyptians had a much more complex understanding. They believed that a person was made up of several distinct parts, each with its own characteristics and needs. There was the physical body, of course, which they called the cat, the flesh and bones that could be touched and seen. But there were also multiple spiritual components, and understanding these is absolutely crucial to understanding how they thought about sleep. The most important of these, for our purposes tonight, were the Ka and the Ba, though there were others as well, including the Ark, the Ren, and the Shadow. The Ka is often translated as the life force or vital essence. It was what animated a living person, the spark that made them alive rather than dead. You might think of it almost like an energetic double of the physical body, a kind of spiritual duplicate that was born at the same time as the physical body and remained with it throughout life. The Ka was created at birth, breathed into existence by the gods, and it needed sustenance just as the body did, which is why ancient Egyptians left food offerings at tombs. They weren't really expecting the dead body to eat. They were feeding the Ka, which continued to exist after death and needed nourishment to survive in the afterlife. The Ka was tied to identity and personality, but in a way that was closely linked to physical existence. It required a physical body or at least a representation of one, which is one reason why statues of the deceased were so important. The Ba, on the other hand, was more like what we might call personality or individuality. It was the aspect of a person that made them uniquely themselves, their character, their personal qualities, the essence of their individual identity. The Ba was often depicted in Egyptian art as a bird with a human head, which gives you a sense of its nature. It could move freely. It wasn't bound to the physical body in the same way the Ka was. The bird form symbolized the Ba's ability to travel, to fly between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, to visit places and experience things that the physical body couldn't access. After death, the Ba would need to be reunited with the body periodically, which is one reason why preservation of the body through mummification was so important. The Ba needed a home to return to, a physical anchor in the material world. Now, here's where this becomes crucial for understanding Egyptian attitudes towards sleep. During sleep, the Egyptians believed that these spiritual components, particularly the Ba, could separate from the physical body and travel. The sleeping person wasn't just unconscious. They were experiencing a kind of temporary death, a preview of what would happen when they died permanently. The Ba would wander, sometimes visiting places the person had been, sometimes encountering gods or spirits, sometimes receiving messages or visions. This is why dreams were taken so seriously in ancient Egypt. They weren't just random firings of neurons or the brain processing the day's events. They were actual experiences that the Ba was having in other realms of existence. But this created a problem. If the Ba left the body during sleep, the sleeping person was vulnerable. What if the Ba couldn't find its way back? What if malevolent spirits attacked the sleeping body while the Ba was away? What if the Ka was somehow damaged or diminished during these nightly journeys? This anxiety about the vulnerability of sleep shows up throughout Egyptian culture. It's in their magic spells, their religious texts, their medical papyri. It's visible in the objects they placed near their beds and the rituals they performed before lying down to rest. This is one reason why the ancient Egyptians paid such close attention to sleep positions. The way you positioned your body wasn't just about physical comfort. It had spiritual implications. It could affect whether your Ba returned safely in the morning. It could determine what kinds of dreams you had, whether they would be prophetic visions from benevolent gods or nightmares sent by demons. It could influence the quality of your sleep and, by extension, your health and well-being the next day. Before we dive into the specific positions that were preferred or avoided, let's paint a picture of what the sleeping environment was like in ancient Egypt. This varied enormously depending on social class and time period, of course. Egypt's civilization lasted for over 3,000 years, longer than the span from ancient Rome to the present day. What was true for a wealthy noble in the Old Kingdom might have been quite different from what a farmer experienced in the New Kingdom. But we can sketch some general patterns based on archaeological evidence, artistic depictions, and written sources. For most ordinary Egyptians, sleeping arrangements were relatively simple. They might sleep on woven reed mats placed directly on the floor, perhaps on the flat roof of their home during the hot summer months when the cool night air made outdoor sleeping pleasant. The heat during the day in much of Egypt was intense, making shade and air movement precious. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in bands of orange and gold and deep purple, the temperature would start to become bearable again. The evening brought relief, a gradual cooling that made it possible to think clearly again after the stunning heat of midday. Houses were often built with this in mind, with thick mud brick walls that absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, helping to regulate temperature. The walls might be 2 feet thick or more, creating substantial thermal mass. During the day, they prevented the full force of the sun's heat from penetrating into the interior spaces. At night, as the air cooled, they radiated stored heat back out, keeping the interior from getting too cold. This was passive climate control, developed through generations of experience living in an extreme environment. The floors were typically packed earth or mud brick, and while this might seem uncomfortable to us, remember that people become accustomed to what they know. A mat on a hard floor was normal, not a hardship. The floor would be swept clean regularly, kept free of dust and debris. The surface would be smooth from years of foot traffic and regular maintenance. It wasn't like lying on bare earth or rough stone. It was a prepared surface, hard yes, but not uncomfortable once you were used to it, especially with a woven mat providing some cushioning. The mats themselves were crafted with care, woven from reeds gathered along the Nile's banks. The weaving was tight and even, creating a surface that was flexible enough to be somewhat comfortable but firm enough to provide support. Some mats were quite fine, almost like fabric, while others were coarser. The quality depended on the skill of the weaver and the intended use. A sleeping mat would generally be finer than a mat used for sitting or working. These mats could be rolled up during the day, freeing the space for other activities, then unrolled at night when it was time to sleep. This flexibility was important in small houses where space served multiple purposes. Wealthier Egyptians had more elaborate sleeping arrangements. They had wooden bed frames, sometimes quite beautiful pieces of furniture with carved legs in the shape of lion paws or other animals. These beds were typically quite low to the ground by our standards, raising the sleeper only a foot or two off the floor. The frame would be strung with leather straps or woven plant fiber to create a sleeping surface, something like a suspended platform. On top of this, they might place additional mats or linen sheets for comfort. The very wealthy might have beds inlaid with precious materials like ivory or ebony, true works of craftsmanship that were as much about displaying status as about providing comfortable sleep. One of the most distinctive features of Egyptian sleeping arrangements, found across all social classes, was the headrest. Instead of soft pillows like we use today, Egyptians slept with their heads elevated on curved pieces of wood, stone, or even ivory. These headrests, called wurs in ancient Egyptian, are found in tombs and houses throughout Egyptian history. They consisted of a curved top piece designed to cradle the neck, supported by a pedestal that raised the head several inches off the sleeping surface. To our modern sensibilities, these look incredibly uncomfortable. How could anyone sleep with their head resting on a hard wooden curve instead of a soft pillow? It seems almost masochistic, like deliberate discomfort when more pleasant options must have been available. But there are several reasons for the widespread use of headrests, and understanding them helps us understand how differently the Egyptians thought about comfort and safety. Practically, in the hot Egyptian climate, a headrest allowed air to circulate around the head and neck, helping to keep the sleeper cool. Anyone who has tried to sleep in intense heat knows how uncomfortable it is to have your head pressed into a soft surface that traps heat and sweat. The hard headrest, while it might seem uncomfortable at first, actually provided better temperature regulation. It also elevated the head, which might have helped with breathing and reducing snoring, issues that would have been just as annoying to ancient Egyptian households as they are to modern ones. But the spiritual and symbolic reasons were probably even more important. The headrest elevated and protected the head, which housed the person's consciousness and was therefore especially vulnerable during sleep. It kept the head separate from the earth, creating a kind of boundary. The head was sacred, the seat of thought and perception. It needed to be protected from contamination or spiritual attack. In a culture where symbolism and ritual were woven through every aspect of life, this wasn't just furniture. It was protective equipment for the dangerous journey of sleep. The elevation created separation, and in a world where spiritual forces were as real as physical ones, separation provided safety. Headrests were often inscribed with spells or decorated with images of protective deities. Some had images of Biz, the dwarf god who protected households and warded off evil spirits. Biz was an unusual figure in Egyptian mythology, not tall and dignified like most gods but short and even comical in appearance, with a face that might have been described as ugly. But his protective power was undisputed. He guarded homes, protected women in childbirth, and warded off nightmares and malevolent entities that prowled the darkness. Having his image on your headrest meant you slept under his watchful protection. Others might show Tauret, the hippopotamus goddess who protected women in childbirth and also offered protection during sleep. Tauret combined features of a hippo, a crocodile, and a lion, three of the most dangerous animals in the Egyptian environment, channeling their ferocity in service of protection. These weren't just decorations. They were active magical protection, transforming an everyday object into a tool for defending the sleeper against spiritual threats. The act of laying your head on these protective images each night reinforced the connection, activated the magic, invoked the deity's presence and power. The positioning of the bed itself mattered as well. When possible, beds were oriented along a north-south axis, with the sleeper's head pointing north. This alignment was thought to harmonize with cosmic forces, with the movement of celestial bodies and the flow of spiritual energy through the world. The North Star was particularly significant in Egyptian cosmology, representing a fixed point in the heavens that never moved, a symbol of stability and eternal life. By aligning oneself with this axis during sleep, when the BA was traveling through spiritual realms, the sleeper was connecting themselves to these larger cosmic patterns. The climate and environment of Egypt also shaped sleeping patterns in practical ways. The Nile's annual flood, which brought fertility to the land, also dictated the rhythm of life. During the inundation season, when the river rose and covered the fields, work patterns changed. People might have more time for rest. During the planting and harvest seasons, the days were long and exhausting, making good sleep even more crucial. The intense heat of summer meant that people often tried to sleep during the hottest part of the day if possible, working in the early morning and late afternoon when it was cooler, and then sleeping again at night. This pattern of divided sleep, with a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night, seems to have been common in many pre-modern societies and probably characterized Egyptian sleep patterns as well. Evening routines were important for preparing body and spirit for sleep. As the sun set and darkness began to claim the land, people would shift from the activities of day to the quiet of night. This transition wasn't abrupt. It was gradual, mirroring the gradual fading of light as the sun sank below the horizon. The work of the day would wind down slowly. If you were a farmer, you'd finish the evening feeding of animals, make sure everything was secure for the night. If you were a craftsperson, you'd put away your tools, clean your workspace, prepare for tomorrow's work. If you were a scribe or official, you'd finish the day's records, seal important documents, organize your materials. There were rituals to be observed, small acts that marked the boundary between day and night, between the active solar realm and the mysterious lunar realm. Incense might be burned, filling the air with the scent of myrrh or frankincense, smoke rising like prayers to the gods, carrying human words and intentions up to the divine realm. These weren't just pleasant smells, though they were certainly that. Incense purified the air, driving away negative spiritual influences that might disturb sleep or attract harmful entities that prowled the darkness looking for vulnerable souls. The act of burning incense was itself a kind of offering, acknowledging the gods and asking for their protection through the vulnerable hours ahead, those dangerous hours when the BA traveled away from the body and evil spirits might find their way into unprotected spaces. The quality of the incense mattered. The finest myrrh and frankincense came from far away, brought by traders traveling dangerous routes through deserts and mountains. These premium resins produced sweet, complex smoke that lingered pleasantly for hours. Cheaper incense, made from local plants and resins, worked adequately but didn't have the same depth of fragrance or the same spiritual potency. Those who could afford it used the best incense they could get, understanding that quality mattered when dealing with gods and spirits. But even simple incense was better than none, and even the poorest household would try to burn something, even just dried herbs from the riverbank, to mark the evening transition and ask for protection. The evening meal was kept light, based on the understanding that heavy food disturbed sleep. Herbs and plants known for their calming properties might be consumed, things like coriander or other aromatic plants. Some people would apply oils or salves scented with myrrh to their neck and wrists, both for the pleasant scent and for the spiritual protection these substances were believed to offer. These weren't random superstitions. They represent a systematic approach to sleep hygiene, developed over centuries of observation and practice, blended with spiritual beliefs about what promoted good rest and what invited trouble. Amulets played an important role in protecting sleep. These might be placed under the pillow or headrest, or worn on the body while sleeping. Different amulets offered different kinds of protection. An Eye of Horus might protect against evil spirits. An Ankh, the symbol of life, would strengthen the Ka. A Djed pillar, representing stability and the backbone of Osiris, would keep the sleeper grounded and protected. Scarab beetles, sacred to the sun god Ra, might be placed nearby to ensure that the sleeper would awaken again, just as Ra was reborn each morning. These weren't just good luck charms in some vague sense. Each had specific protective functions based on the mythology and symbolism associated with it. For those who could afford it, there were more elaborate preparations. Priests might be consulted if someone was having persistent nightmares or insomnia. These priest-physicians occupied a dual role, understanding both the medical and spiritual dimensions of health. They might prescribe herbal remedies for physical conditions affecting sleep, things like indigestion or pain. But they would also perform rituals, recite spells, and create magical objects to address spiritual causes of poor sleep. In extreme cases, carefully measured amounts of poppy seeds might be used to induce deep sleep. The ancient Egyptians knew about opium's sleep-inducing properties, but they also understood its dangers and potential for harm if overused. This knowledge was typically controlled by priests and physicians, not something ordinary people would use casually. The fact that they knew about and occasionally used such substances shows sophisticated observation of how different plants and substances affected consciousness and sleep. But the careful restrictions around their use also shows understanding of moderation and the recognition that not all sleep was equal. Sleep induced by powerful drugs was different from natural sleep, and while it might sometimes be necessary, it wasn't the ideal. The observation of the night sky was another element of sleep preparation for some Egyptians. Priests in temples would track the movements of stars and planets, determining auspicious times for various activities including sleep. The hours of night were divided and associated with different deities and different qualities of spiritual energy. Going to sleep at the right time, when the cosmic forces were favorable, could mean the difference between peaceful rest with helpful dreams and a night of spiritual disturbance. Now we come to the heart of our exploration, the positions in which ancient Egyptians slept and why some were preferred while others were avoided. Let's start with what we know most confidently, based on archaeological evidence, artistic depictions, and written sources. The most favored position for sleep was lying on the right side with the arms crossed over the chest. This posture appears repeatedly in tomb paintings, on stelae showing people resting, and in the burial positions of mummies. It wasn't random or merely comfortable. This position had deep symbolic meaning rooted in Egyptian mythology and religion, connecting to one of the most powerful and central myths of their entire civilization. To understand why, we need to talk about Osiris, one of the most important gods in the Egyptian pantheon. Osiris was the god of the afterlife, of death and resurrection, of the fertile Nile Valley and the grain that grew from the earth. His mythology was central to Egyptian beliefs about death, burial, and the possibility of life after death. According to the myth, which was told and retold in various versions throughout Egyptian history, Osiris was originally a king who ruled Egypt in a golden age of prosperity and justice. He taught humans agriculture, gave them laws, showed them how to worship the gods properly. He was beloved by his subjects and admired by the gods. But Osiris had a jealous brother named Set. Set envied Osiris's power and popularity. He resented being overshadowed by his older brother. So Set hatched a plan to kill Osiris and take his throne. The details vary in different versions of the myth, but in one common telling, Set invited Osiris to a feast and unveiled a beautiful coffin, claiming he would give it to whoever fit perfectly inside. When Osiris lay down in the coffin to try it, Set and his conspirators slammed the lid shut, sealed it, and threw it into the Nile. Osiris drowned, trapped in the coffin as it floated downstream and eventually out to sea. But the story doesn't end with Osiris's death. His wife Isis, who was also his sister in the way that Egyptian royal families intermarried, refused to accept his death as final. She searched throughout Egypt and beyond for Osiris's body. When she finally found the coffin washed up on the shore of Byblos in Lebanon, she brought it back to Egypt. But Set discovered this and, in a rage, tore Osiris's body into 14 pieces, or in some versions 42 pieces, and scattered them across the entire length of Egypt so they could never be reunited. Isis, undeterred and heartbroken, searched again. She traveled the length of Egypt, finding the scattered pieces of her husband's body one by one. With the help of her sister Nephthys and the jackal-headed god Anubis, she reassembled Osiris's body. Through powerful magic and sacred rites, Isis was able to resurrect Osiris, at least partially. She breathed life back into him long enough to conceive a child, Horus, who would eventually avenge his father by defeating Set. But Osiris didn't fully return to life in this world. Instead, he descended to the underworld to become its ruler, the Lord of the Dead, the judge who weighed souls and determined who would be granted eternal life. In artistic depictions and in the careful wrapping of mummies, Osiris is shown lying on his side with his arms crossed over his chest, often holding the crook and flail that symbolized kingship. This was called the Osirian pose, and it became the standard position for the dead. The mummy was wrapped to hold the arms in this position. Tomb paintings showed the deceased in this pose. It represented not death as an ending but death as a transition, a state from which resurrection was possible. By positioning the body like Osiris, the dead person was identifying themselves with the god and invoking his power of renewal and eternal life. But this symbolism didn't apply only to the dead. Remember, for the ancient Egyptians, sleep was a kind of temporary death. Each night, when they lay down to rest, they were in a sense rehearsing for their eventual final sleep. The barriers between the sleeping and the dead were thin. By sleeping in the Osirian pose, on their side with arms crossed, they were positioning themselves for spiritual renewal. They were connecting to the mythology of death and rebirth. They were saying, in effect, I will awaken just as Osiris arose, I will be renewed just as the sun is reborn each dawn. This small death of sleep will lead to the resurrection of morning. This wasn't just symbolic thinking without practical effect. From a psychological perspective, rituals and positions that connect to powerful mythologies can genuinely affect experience. If you believe that sleeping in a certain position connects you to divine forces of renewal, you may well sleep more peacefully. The sense of spiritual protection and cosmic harmony that came from adopting the Osirian pose likely contributed to better sleep quality, even from a completely secular modern perspective. Within the broader category of side sleeping, there was a strong preference for lying on the right side specifically rather than the left. This preference connected to another important Egyptian deity, Thoth, the god of wisdom, writing, magic, and the moon. Thoth was the divine scribe who recorded the judgment of souls in the afterlife. He was associated with knowledge, with prophecy, with the interpretation of dreams and divine messages. And Thoth was particularly connected with the right side of the body. By sleeping on the right side, Egyptians believed they were honoring Thoth and opening themselves to receive wisdom through their dreams. The right side was seen as auspicious, connected to order and light, while the left side had more ambiguous associations. This right side preference appears in medical texts as well, where lying on the right side was sometimes recommended for health reasons. Whether there were actual physiological benefits or whether the health improvements came from the psychological effects of believing you were following divine guidance is hard to say. Probably it was some combination of both. The positioning of the head pointing north, as we mentioned earlier, was also important. This north-south alignment during sleep was thought to harmonize with cosmic energy flows, with the movement of celestial bodies, with the fundamental structure of the universe itself. In this, the Egyptians were remarkably similar to later traditions in other cultures. Chinese feng shui and Indian Vastu Shastra also emphasize the importance of cardinal directions for sleep, though the specific recommendations differ. The Egyptians were part of a broader human pattern of trying to align daily activities with cosmic patterns, seeking to live in harmony with the fundamental forces that governed existence. Archaeological evidence supports these preferences. When we look at the burial positions of mummies from different periods and social classes, we consistently see side-lying positions with arms crossed. When we examine furniture from tombs, like the famous folding bed found in Tutankhamun's tomb, the design suggests that people slept on their sides. The bed was relatively narrow and firm, not designed for sprawling on one's back. The headrest automatically positioned the head in a way that was most comfortable for side sleeping. There's also evidence of flexed or fetal positions, particularly in earlier periods of Egyptian history. Burials from the Badarian period, before the development of mummification, often show bodies positioned in a tightly flexed posture, knees drawn up toward the chest. This might reflect actual sleeping positions from life. A flexed position offered several advantages. In cooler weather, it conserved body heat. It took up less space on a sleeping mat or bed. And symbolically, it echoed the position of a child in the womb, connecting to themes of rebirth and renewal that were so central to Egyptian thought. But if these positions were preferred and recommended, were there positions that were actively avoided or even forbidden? This is where we enter more speculative territory, where we must be careful to distinguish between solid evidence and interpretations that seem plausible but can't be definitively proven. There's no ancient Egyptian text that says, "Do not sleep on your left side," or "lying on your back is forbidden." What we have instead are scattered clues, patterns in how positions are depicted, associations with certain deities, and attempts by modern scholars to piece together beliefs from fragmentary evidence. The strongest case for an avoided position concerns sleeping in ways associated with Set, the god of chaos, storms, violence, and disorder. Set was a complex figure in Egyptian mythology. He wasn't purely evil in the way we might think of a devil or demon in later religious traditions. He had important roles to play. He protected Ra during the sun god's nightly journey through the underworld, fighting off the chaos serpent Apophis. The pharaohs of the Second Dynasty actually took Set as their patron deity. But Set was also the murderer of Osiris, and he represented forces of chaos and disruption that were antithetical to the Egyptian love of order and harmony. Set was particularly associated with the left side, with prone positions, with disorder and chaos. There's some evidence, though it requires interpretation, that sleeping in positions thought to be associated with Set might have been avoided, particularly by priests and those who were especially concerned with ritual purity and spiritual protection. The logic would be this: if sleeping on the right side honors Thoth and connects you to wisdom and order, then sleeping predominantly on the left side might dishonor those forces and instead align you with Set's chaos. If the Osirian pose on your side represents resurrection and renewal, then sleeping face down in a sprawled position might represent the opposite, a kind of submission to disorder. Some scholars have speculated that face-down, prone positions were particularly avoided. The reasoning is several-fold. First, such positions don't appear in artistic depictions of proper rest or burial. Second, a face-down position would muffle breathing and press the face into the sleeping surface, which pragmatically isn't great for restful sleep. Third, and perhaps most importantly, a prone sprawl could be seen as animalistic, lacking the dignified posture that separated civilized humans from beasts. In a culture that placed enormous emphasis on proper form, on ritual correctness, on maintaining order against chaos, sleeping in a disorderly sprawl might have been seen as spiritually risky. There's also evidence suggesting that sleeping flat on one's back might have been discouraged, though this is more uncertain. The reasoning would be related to vulnerability. In a back sleeping position, the chest and abdomen are exposed rather than protected. The arms, if placed at the sides, aren't in the protective cross position. Some texts suggest concern that sleeping on the back might trap the BA, preventing it from traveling freely or returning easily. The flat position, without the curvature of side sleeping, might be seen as too much like a corpse laid out for burial before mummification, dangerous spiritual territory for someone who intended to wake up in the morning. It's important to emphasize that these interpretations about avoided positions are less certain than our knowledge of preferred positions. We have abundant positive evidence for side sleeping with crossed arms, for right side preference, for north-south alignment. We have much more limited and ambiguous evidence for positions that were actively discouraged. The absence of something in artistic depictions or written descriptions doesn't necessarily prove it was forbidden or even avoided. It might simply mean it wasn't considered noteworthy or worthy of special attention. Moreover, we need to be careful about overstating the degree of control or enforcement. Ancient Egypt wasn't a totalitarian state with bedtime police ensuring that everyone slept in approved positions. Most people, most of the time, probably slept however they found comfortable, shaped by their furniture, their climate, their personal habits. The preferences and avoidances we're discussing would have been most rigorously followed by priests, by those serving in temples, by people who were especially devout or who had received instructions from priest-physicians for specific health or spiritual concerns. For the average farmer or craftsperson, the influence of these beliefs would have been more general, a vague sense that some positions were better than others, absorbed through cultural osmosis rather than enforced by authority. That said, beliefs don't need to be enforced to be influential. If you grow up in a culture where everyone agrees that sleeping on your right side brings good dreams and wisdom, you'll probably prefer your right side even if no one is checking on you. If you believe that certain positions anger the gods or attract malevolent spirits, you'll avoid them even without threats of punishment. Cultural norms work through internalization, through what seems natural and obvious rather than through external enforcement. Let's talk more about the physical objects that shaped Egyptian sleep, because these give us concrete evidence of how people actually rested. The headrest, which we've already mentioned, deserves more attention because it's such a distinctive feature of Egyptian sleeping arrangements and because it connects so directly to spiritual beliefs about sleep. Headrests were made from various materials depending on the owner's wealth and status. Common materials included wood, which was relatively precious in the largely treeless landscape of Egypt. Wood for furniture often had to be imported from Lebanon or other regions with forests, making it a luxury item. Cheaper headrests might be made from carved limestone or other local stone. The wealthiest individuals might have headrests made from expensive imported ebony or decorated with ivory inlays. The basic design remained consistent across these variations. A curved top piece, shaped to cradle the neck, rose on a pedestal or column. The curve might be quite pronounced, forming almost a deep channel for the neck, or it might be a gentler curve. The height varied, with some headrests raising the head only a few inches and others lifting it higher. The pedestal connecting the curved top to the base might be a simple column, or it might be elaborately carved, sometimes with openwork designs, sometimes with protective symbols and imagery. Using a headrest required sleeping on your side. You simply couldn't use one while sleeping on your back or stomach in any comfortable way. The design of the object thus enforced side sleeping positions. This wasn't an accident. The headrest's design reflected and reinforced beliefs about proper sleep positioning. It was both practical and symbolic, serving the dual purpose of elevating and cooling the head while also positioning the sleeper in spiritually correct postures. Many headrests were inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead or with prayers to protective deities. These inscriptions transformed the object from simple furniture into magical protection. One common spell asked that the sleeper's head be protected, that they might awaken safely in the morning, that their eyes might open again like the rising sun. Another might invoke Biz or Toret to guard the sleeper against nightmares and evil spirits. The headrest became a talisman, a shield against the dangers of the night. In tombs, headrests were placed with the dead for use in the afterlife. The belief was that just as the deceased would need food and drink in the next world, they would also need rest. The presence of headrests in tombs tells us that these weren't considered temporary possessions for earthly life alone but essential equipment for eternal existence. The most famous example is probably the 3 headrests found in Tutankhamun's tomb, each beautifully crafted, each designed to accompany the young pharaoh into eternity. The beds themselves varied by social class but followed some common patterns. For those who had them, bed frames were typically made of wood, often quite simple in construction but sometimes elaborately decorated. The frame formed a rectangle, usually around 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, smaller than modern beds. The sleeping surface wasn't a solid platform but a woven mesh of leather strips or plant fiber, creating a slightly flexible surface that would give under the sleeper's weight. This had practical advantages in terms of comfort and ventilation, but it also reinforced side sleeping positions because the surface would sag in the middle, naturally encouraging the sleeper to curl on their side. The legs of beds were often carved with symbolic meanings. Lion legs were popular, invoking the strength and protective qualities of these apex predators. The lion was associated with several Egyptian deities and with the power of the pharaoh. Having your bed supported by lion legs was both a status symbol and a form of spiritual protection. Other animal forms might be used as well, each bringing their own symbolic associations. Wealthier beds might have footboards and sometimes headboards, though full enclosures were rare. The footboard prevented the sleeper from sliding off the bed during the night, a practical consideration given that the woven surface would tend to slope. The footboard was also frequently decorated with protective imagery or inscriptions. Some beds had a slight slope, with the head end elevated compared to the foot end, which would have encouraged blood flow away from the feet and toward the head, possibly helpful for some medical conditions. Folding beds, like the one found in Tutankhamun's tomb, were portable sleeping arrangements for travel or for use in different locations. These were clever pieces of engineering, designed to fold in half for transport while still providing a stable sleeping surface when opened. The existence of such beds tells us that wealthy Egyptians traveled with their own sleeping equipment rather than relying on what might be available at their destination, similar to how some modern travelers bring their own pillows. The linens used on beds were typically made from flax, woven into linen cloth. Egypt was famous for its linen production, creating cloth so fine it was semi-transparent, highly prized throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. The wealthy would have had multiple layers of linen sheets, creating a softer sleeping surface and providing warmth when needed. The quality of linen varied enormously. The finest royal linen had thread counts comparable to good modern sheets. Ordinary linen was coarser but still comfortable and practical. Linen was preferred over wool in Egypt for several reasons. Practically, linen is cooler and more comfortable in hot climates. It wicks moisture away from the skin and dries quickly. But there were also religious reasons. Wool came from animals and was considered impure for certain ritual contexts. Priests were forbidden from wearing wool in temples or during religious ceremonies. Linen, derived from plants, was seen as cleaner and more appropriate for sacred contexts. Since sleep had spiritual dimensions, and since all life had religious aspects for the Egyptians, the preference for linen extended to sleeping arrangements. Mosquito netting, made from fine linen, might be draped over beds to protect against insects. Anyone who has spent time in tropical or subtropical climates knows how crucial this is for restful sleep. The Nile's annual flooding created perfect breeding conditions for mosquitoes, making protection against them essential. The netting would be suspended from above, perhaps from beams or poles, creating a protected space within which the sleeper could rest undisturbed by buzzing insects. For poorer Egyptians who slept on mats rather than beds, the arrangements were simpler but followed similar patterns. A woven reed mat would be laid on the floor or ground. A linen sheet might be placed on top of it, and perhaps another sheet for covering. The headrest would still be used, positioned at one end of the mat. These simpler arrangements were probably easier to adapt to seasonal changes. In hot weather, the mat could be placed on a rooftop for cooling breezes. In cooler weather, it could be moved inside, perhaps near a small fire or brazier for warmth. The rituals around preparing for sleep were as important as the physical arrangements. As evening approached and the heat of day began to fade, there was a general slowing of activity. Work wound down. Markets closed. The streets emptied as people returned to their homes. There was a quality of drawing inward, of settling, that matched the natural rhythm of the earth cooling and the light fading. The burning of incense was one of the key evening rituals. Myrrh and frankincense were particularly valued for this purpose. Both had to be imported, myrrh from southern Arabia or the Horn of Africa, frankincense from similar regions, making them expensive and therefore status symbols as well as functional tools. The smoke from these resins was believed to purify the air, driving away negative spiritual influences that might gather in the darkness. The scent itself was pleasing and had some genuine calming properties from a modern scientific perspective. Certain aromatic compounds do affect mood and can promote relaxation. But beyond any physical effects, the ritual of incense burning was psychologically important. It marked the transition from day activities to night rest. It created a sensory signal that it was time to shift mental gears, to leave behind the concerns of work and social interaction and begin preparing for sleep. Modern sleep hygiene recommendations emphasize the importance of consistent evening routines, of creating clear signals that bedtime is approaching. The ancient Egyptians understood this intuitively, without needing scientific studies to confirm it. Prayers and invocations were part of many people's evening routine. These might be formal prayers to specific gods, asking for protection through the night and safe awakening in the morning. Or they might be more informal, personal appeals to whatever deities an individual felt most connected to. Some people might recite protective spells, either from memory or reading from papyrus sheets if they were literate. The act of speaking or reading these words was itself protective, creating a verbal shield around the sleeper. The placement of amulets and magical objects was done with care and intention. An amulet placed under the headrest wasn't just tossed there carelessly. Its position mattered. Some amulets needed to be oriented in specific ways to be effective. The act of placement was itself a small ritual, a conscious acknowledgement of the amulet's purpose and an activation of its protective powers. For people who believed strongly in the reality and effectiveness of these objects, the psychological reassurance they provided would have been substantial. Knowing you were protected allowed you to relax and sleep more easily. Personal hygiene before sleep was important, more so for the wealthy who had the means for elaborate bathing and grooming. Washing the feet and hands at minimum was standard practice. Oil and perfumes might be applied to the skin, both for pleasant scent and for spiritual protection. Certain oils were associated with specific deities and their protective powers. A salve containing myrrh, applied to pulse points at the wrists and neck, might help ward off spirits while its scent provided aromatherapeutic benefits. The diet consumed in the evening hours was deliberately kept light to avoid disrupting sleep. Heavy, hard-to-digest foods were avoided. Instead, people might eat bread, perhaps with honey, some fruits, maybe fish or fowl in small amounts. Coriander and other herbs known for calming properties might be included in evening meals. Beer, which was a dietary staple in ancient Egypt and much less alcoholic than modern beer, might be consumed in moderation. The ancient Egyptians understood through observation what we now know scientifically, that what you eat and drink in the hours before sleep significantly affects sleep quality. Timing sleep according to the movements of stars and the phases of the moon was something only the wealthy and religiously devoted really engaged with, but it influenced the broader culture. The night was divided into watches or hours, each associated with different spiritual qualities. Going to sleep during an auspicious hour could mean the difference between restful sleep and troubled dreams. This required either personal knowledge of astronomy or consultation with priests who tracked such things. The emphasis on correct posture extended to the moment of lying down. This wasn't done carelessly. You consciously positioned yourself on your right side. You carefully crossed your arms over your chest in the Osirian manner. You aligned your body along the bed's north-south axis. You placed your neck in the curve of the headrest. Each of these actions was deliberate, transforming the simple act of going to bed into a kind of ritual performance. The body was positioned not just for physical comfort but for spiritual readiness, for safe passage through the realm of sleep. This ritualization of sleep preparation had psychological benefits that would work even from a completely secular perspective. The conscious, deliberate nature of the preparation created a clear mental break between waking consciousness and sleep. The repetition of the same ritual each night created strong associative learning, where the body and mind came to associate these specific actions with sleep onset. This is exactly what modern cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia tries to achieve through sleep restriction and stimulus control techniques. The ancient Egyptians, through intuition and cultural development over millennia, had arrived at similar practices. Let's turn now to how the ancient Egyptians understood sleep from a medical perspective, because this adds another layer to our understanding of why certain positions and practices were preferred. The medical texts that survive from ancient Egypt, particularly the Ebers Papyrus and the Edwin Smith Papyrus, give us windows into how Egyptian doctors thought about health, illness, and treatment. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE but probably copying older texts, is one of the oldest and most complete medical documents from ancient Egypt. It contains hundreds of remedies and prescriptions for various ailments, including several relating to sleep problems. Insomnia was recognized as a medical condition requiring treatment. The papyrus recommends various herbal preparations for inducing sleep, including mixtures containing poppy seeds, which we now know contain morphine and other sleep-inducing alkaloids. But the Ebers Papyrus doesn't treat sleep problems as purely physical. Many of the remedies combine material treatments with magical spells and invocations. A prescription might tell you to drink a particular herbal infusion while reciting a specific spell to Isis or another deity. This integrated approach, blending what we would call medicine with what we would call magic, reflects the Egyptian worldview in which physical and spiritual realms were interconnected parts of a unified reality. Nightmares and disturbing dreams were taken seriously as medical complaints. They weren't dismissed as meaningless random images but were understood as symptoms of spiritual disturbance or divine displeasure. Treatment might involve physical remedies, like calming herbs, but would also include spiritual interventions. A person suffering from persistent nightmares might need to make offerings to offended deities, have protective amulets prepared, or undergo purification rituals performed by priests. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, slightly earlier than the Ebers Papyrus, is primarily a surgical text dealing with injuries and trauma. But even this practical, relatively empirical document includes sections on general health maintenance that touch on sleep. The papyrus recommends proper rest as essential for healing from injuries and maintaining health. It suggests that the position of the body during rest can affect recovery from certain conditions. Egyptian physician priests understood that poor sleep made people more vulnerable to illness. A person who wasn't sleeping well would be tired, irritable, less able to work effectively, more prone to accidents. Their immune systems would be weakened, though the Egyptians wouldn't have used that terminology. They might have said that their Ka was weakened, or that their spiritual defenses were compromised, but they were describing the same observable phenomenon that we now explain through different conceptual frameworks. The treatments for insomnia and sleep disturbances were varied. Herbal remedies were probably the first line of intervention. Poppy seeds, as mentioned, were used but carefully controlled because their overuse was recognized as dangerous. Other plants with genuinely calming or sedative properties, like valerian or chamomile, might have been used as well, though identifying the exact plants from their ancient Egyptian names is sometimes difficult. Physical manipulations, what we might call massage or bodywork, were part of the medical toolkit. A priest-physician might recommend that a patient's neck and shoulders be massaged before sleep to relax tense muscles. Warm compresses might be applied. These practical physical interventions would have been genuinely helpful for sleep, particularly for people whose insomnia was related to physical discomfort or muscle tension. But beyond physical treatments, there was always the spiritual dimension. If someone was sleeping poorly, it might indicate that they had offended a deity, perhaps unknowingly. They might need to make offerings or undergo purification rituals. Their house might need to be cleansed of negative spiritual influences. They might need new protective amulets to replace ones that had lost their effectiveness. All of these spiritual interventions would have psychological effects, providing reassurance and reducing anxiety, which would in turn improve sleep. The connection between sleep and death was more than metaphorical in Egyptian medical thinking. Sleep was understood as a state where the body approached the boundary of death. Someone who was sleeping very deeply might be hard to wake, their breathing slow and quiet, their body cool and still. This resembled death closely enough to be concerning. The Egyptian phrase for death, going to one's Ka, suggests a joining with the Ka that paralleled what happened in sleep but was permanent rather than temporary. This understanding shaped medical practice around sleep. If someone was sleeping too deeply, if they were hard to rouse, this might be dangerous, a sign that they were crossing too far into the realm of death. Conversely, if someone couldn't sleep at all, their Ba was perhaps unable to separate from the body properly, or their Ka was disturbed and restless. The goal was balance, the right amount and quality of sleep, with proper positioning and protection to ensure safe passage through the dangerous hours of night. Superstitions around sleep extended beyond formal medical practice into everyday life. These folk beliefs, passed down through generations, shaped behavior even for people who never consulted a physician or priest about their sleep. One superstition we know about is the prohibition against sweeping the house after sunset. Sweeping was believed to disturb spirits that were settling in for the night, potentially including benevolent household spirits whose favor was important. This created a practical routine of finishing all cleaning and sweeping before dark, which also had the benefit of not stirring up dust and activity right before trying to sleep. The positioning of beds and sleeping spaces relative to doorways and openings was important in some contexts, though the evidence here is indirect. In some other ancient cultures with which Egypt had contact, there were strong beliefs about never sleeping with your feet pointing toward the door, as this was considered the position of a corpse being carried out for burial. Whether this specific superstition existed in Egypt isn't entirely clear, but the concern about bed positioning was certainly present in their tradition. Mirrors, which were made of polished bronze or copper in ancient Egypt, had ambiguous spiritual associations. Some beliefs held that mirrors could capture or confuse the Ba during sleep, making it difficult for the soul to return to the body. Whether this meant mirrors should be removed from sleeping areas, or covered, or simply positioned carefully isn't specified in the sources we have. But the caution around mirrors shows the concern that everyday objects might have unexpected spiritual effects during the vulnerable state of sleep. The phases of the moon influenced beliefs about sleep quality and dream content. The moon was associated with Thoth, as we've discussed, but also with cycles, with change, with the passage of time. Full moon nights might be associated with particularly vivid dreams or with greater spiritual activity generally. New moon nights might be darker and therefore more dangerous, requiring extra protection. Paying attention to lunar cycles and adjusting sleep practices accordingly was part of the broader Egyptian pattern of aligning human activities with cosmic rhythms. Dreams themselves were understood as a distinct category of experience, separate from but related to sleep. Dreams were messages, either from gods offering guidance and prophecy, or from deceased family members trying to communicate with the living, or sometimes from demons and evil spirits attempting to mislead or frighten. The quality and content of dreams were indicators of spiritual health and divine favor or disfavor. Dream interpretation was a specialized skill. There were professional dream interpreters who could be consulted about particularly vivid or disturbing dreams. Dream books, collections of common dream symbols and their meanings, existed, though few have survived to the present. We know about their existence from references in other texts and from fragments that have been found. These dream books worked through analogy and symbolism. Dreaming of a certain animal might mean one thing, dreaming of water another thing, and so on. But beyond professional interpretation, ordinary people had their own understanding of dream symbolism. Some dreams were understood as straightforward prophecy or communication. If you dreamed of a deceased parent telling you something, you would probably take that seriously as actual communication from the afterlife. If you dreamed of a god appearing to you, that was a significant spiritual event requiring action, perhaps making an offering or visiting a temple. The practice of dream incubation, deliberately seeking revelatory dreams by sleeping in sacred spaces, deserves special attention because it shows how seriously dreams were taken and how they were actively cultivated rather than just passively received. Dream incubation was practiced in various cultures of the ancient world, but it was particularly elaborate in Egypt. Special temples, often dedicated to healing deities like Imhotep or to Isis in her healing aspect, served as dream incubation sites. These were places people could come when they needed divine guidance or healing that couldn't be obtained through ordinary means. The process wasn't simple or casual. It required preparation, purification, and often significant expense in terms of offerings and fees to the temple priests. This wasn't something you did on a whim. It was a serious undertaking, a pilgrimage of sorts, that demonstrated your commitment and desperation. Someone seeking a dream revelation would first undergo purification rituals. This might involve bathing in sacred waters, special pools, or sections of the Nile that were considered particularly holy. The water wasn't just physically cleansing. It washed away spiritual impurities, the accumulated contamination of ordinary life that might block divine communication. You might spend hours or even days in this preparatory phase, depending on the temple's requirements and your particular situation. You would wear clean white linen garments, freshly washed and never worn before, free of any association with your ordinary life. White symbolized purity, cleanliness, death, and rebirth. The priests might require you to abstain from certain foods, particularly meat or wine, things considered too heavy or worldly for someone seeking divine contact. You might need to abstain from sexual activity for a period before the incubation. The idea was to make oneself as spiritually clean and receptive as possible, to become an empty vessel ready to receive the God's message. Impurities of body or spirit might block or distort divine communication. You wanted to approach the gods humble and clean, not carrying the spiritual baggage of everyday existence. After preparation, the seeker would make offerings at the temple, prayers, and gifts appropriate to the deity being petitioned. These offerings could be substantial, depending on your means and the seriousness of your petition. A wealthy person might offer silver or gold, fine incense, quality linens. A poorer person might offer what they could, perhaps a simple clay figurine, some bread and beer, flowers from the riverbank. The gods were believed to appreciate sincerity more than wealth, but everyone gave what they could. Then, in the evening, they would be allowed to sleep within the temple precinct, often in a special room or area designated for this purpose. The sleeping arrangements in these dream incubation spaces followed the same principles as ordinary sleep: headrests, north-south alignment, side sleeping positions, but with the added context of sacred space heightening everything. The night spent in the temple was understood as an opportunity for direct divine contact. During sleep, when the BA traveled to other realms, it could more easily encounter gods and receive their messages. The sacred context of the temple, already charged with divine presence through centuries of worship and ritual, made such encounters more likely. The very walls seemed to hum with accumulated spiritual energy. The seeker would hope to dream of the deity they had petitioned, to receive healing, guidance, or answers to questions that troubled them. Every sound in the night might take on significance. Was that footstep a priest making rounds? Or was it the god approaching? That whisper of wind through the columns, was it natural air movement, or was it divine breath carrying a message? In the morning, the seeker would report their dream to the temple priests, who would help interpret its meaning and prescribe any follow-up actions. Sometimes the dream would directly provide healing. A person might go to sleep sick and wake healed, attributing the cure to divine intervention during the dream state. Other times, the dream would provide symbolic guidance that required interpretation before its meaning became clear. The most famous dream incubation site in Egypt was probably the complex at Deir el-Bahari, a mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes. This site was particularly associated with Ether and Amenhotep, son of Hapu, who was deified after death and became a healing god. People came from throughout Egypt and sometimes from other lands to sleep at this sacred site and seek dreams of guidance and healing. The practice continued for centuries, showing its enduring importance in Egyptian religious life. Dream incubation wasn't for everyone. It required resources, the ability to travel to the temple, to pay fees and make offerings, to spend time away from work and responsibilities. But the fact that it existed and was taken seriously shows the central importance of dreams in Egyptian culture. Dreams weren't random mental noise. They were genuine experiences of the BA in spiritual realms, opportunities for communication with the divine, and windows into knowledge that couldn't be accessed through ordinary waking consciousness. Now let's look at the archaeological evidence more systematically, because this gives us the firmest grounding for understanding Egyptian sleep practices. Unlike beliefs and attitudes, which we have to infer from texts and images, the physical objects that survive provide direct evidence of what people actually used and how they arranged their sleeping spaces. Tutankhamun's tomb, discovered largely intact in 1922, provides the most complete picture we have of royal sleeping arrangements from ancient Egypt. Among the thousands of objects found in the tomb were 3 wooden bed frames, each different in design and probably used for different purposes or locations. One is a simple folding bed made of ebony, designed for portability. Another is more elaborate, with a curved footboard and legs carved in the form of lion legs and hooves. The third is decorated with images of Biz, the protective dwarf deity, emphasizing the bed's role as a protected sleeping space. Along with the beds were multiple headrests, some made of wood and decorated with gold and ivory, others made of solid alabaster. The variety shows that even a single individual might use different headrests in different contexts. The most elaborate headrest from Tutankhamun's tomb is made of blue faience and shaped in a complex form with images of the god Shu supporting the curved top piece, symbolically showing the god holding up the sky while the pharaoh slept beneath. The tomb also contained fine linens, some of the highest quality textile work that has survived from ancient Egypt. The thread count and weave quality of these linens is remarkable even by modern standards. They would have provided a soft, comfortable sleeping surface on top of the leather-strung bed frames. The presence of multiple sets of linens suggests they were changed and washed regularly, showing attention to cleanliness and hygiene in sleeping arrangements. Beyond Tutankhamun's tomb, other burial sites have yielded sleeping-related objects. Headrests are among the most common items found in tombs from all periods of Egyptian history, from the earliest dynasties through the Ptolemaic period. They're found in tombs of ordinary people as well as the wealthy and royal, showing that this was a cultural universal rather than an elite luxury. The quality and materials varied with the owner's status, but the basic form and function remained consistent. Coffins from the Old Kingdom, particularly the 6th dynasty, sometimes feature representations of the bed frames and headrests that were placed with the deceased. These miniature representations or full-sized furniture pieces placed in the tomb show us the design and construction methods used. The slatted nature of bed frames, the way leather strips were interlaced to create the sleeping surface, the joinery techniques used to connect wooden pieces without metal fasteners, all of these practical details are preserved in the archaeological record. Some coffins from later periods were actually designed to look like beds, with footboards and decorative elements mimicking furniture. This emphasized the understanding of death as sleep, the final rest from which the deceased would awaken in the afterlife. The decoration on such coffins often includes images related to protection and rebirth, similar to the protective imagery found on headrests and amulets. Wall paintings and relief carvings from tombs show people in sleeping or resting postures, usually on their sides with arms positioned across the chest. While these are artistic representations rather than photographs, and we should be cautious about taking them as literal depictions of how everyone slept, they do show us what was considered the proper and dignified way to rest. The consistency of these depictions across different time periods and geographic regions within Egypt suggests these weren't just artistic conventions but reflected actual practices. Stele, stone monuments that might be erected for various purposes including marking tombs or commemorating individuals, sometimes show people in reclining positions. These too are typically side-lying poses. The formal, careful nature of these images suggests they represent idealized rest rather than casual napping, which reinforces the idea that side sleeping with specific arm positions was the culturally approved and spiritually proper way to rest. Actual sleeping spaces have been excavated at various sites, particularly at Deir el-Medina, the village that housed the workers who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. These houses provide insights into how ordinary people lived, including where and how they slept. Most houses had specific sleeping areas, often in upper rooms or on roof terraces during hot weather. The spaces were relatively small by modern standards, with entire families sleeping in close proximity. The arrangement of these sleeping spaces shows attention to orientation and protection even in modest dwellings. When possible, sleeping areas were positioned to allow north-south alignment of the sleepers. Doorways and windows were positioned with care, though whether this was primarily for practical concerns like ventilation and privacy or also for spiritual protection isn't always clear. The inclusion of small niches in walls where amulets or small protective statues could be placed suggests that spiritual protection of sleeping spaces was a concern even for working-class families. Temples that served as dream incubation sites have architectural features that reveal their function. At Deir el-Bahari and other locations, certain rooms or courts have features suggesting they were designed for overnight stays by pilgrims seeking revelatory dreams. These might include benches or platforms where people could sleep, positioned in relation to shrines or altars in ways that would facilitate spiritual connection during sleep. The physical evidence, taken together, paints a remarkably consistent picture. Side sleeping on relatively firm surfaces with neck support from headrests was the norm across social classes and time periods. The attention to protective symbolism, from amulets to decorated headrests to carefully chosen bed orientations, shows that sleep was understood as requiring spiritual protection. The quality and elaboration of sleeping equipment varied with wealth, but the basic patterns were cultural universals, suggesting deeply rooted beliefs and practices that spanned Egypt's long history. To understand these sleep practices more fully, we need to step back and look at the broader cosmic context in which the ancient Egyptians understood everything, including sleep. Their worldview was fundamentally different from our modern secular perspective, and without appreciating this difference, we might miss crucial aspects of why they approached sleep the way they did. For the ancient Egyptians, the universe was not a mechanistic system of mindless forces and random chance. It was a living, intentional reality permeated by divine presence and purpose. The gods weren't distant abstract concepts. They were real, active beings who intervened in the world constantly. Natural phenomena like the rising and setting of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, the cycle of seasons, these weren't automatic processes but the results of divine actions that required constant maintenance. The central organizing principle of Egyptian cosmology was Ma'at, a concept that doesn't translate easily into English. Ma'at is often rendered as truth, justice, or order, but it encompasses much more than any single word can capture. Ma'at was the proper order of things, the way the universe should function, the balance and harmony that allowed life to flourish. Ma'at was embodied as a goddess, but it was also a principle, a force, a standard against which all actions and situations were measured. Opposing Ma'at was Isfet, chaos, disorder, injustice, everything that threatened to unravel the proper functioning of existence. Isfet was the primordial chaos from which the world had been created and into which it would collapse if Ma'at wasn't constantly maintained. The gods worked to uphold Ma'at. The pharaoh, as a divine or semi-divine figure, had a special responsibility to maintain Ma'at within Egypt. But ordinary people also had roles to play. Every action could either support Ma'at or contribute to Isfet. Sleep fit into this cosmological framework. Proper sleep, with correct positioning, adequate protection, and appropriate rituals, supported Ma'at. It allowed the body and spirit to rest and renew, maintaining the health and effectiveness that enabled a person to fulfill their duties and responsibilities. Disturbed sleep, nightmares, insomnia, these were signs of Isfet gaining ground, whether in the individual's life or more broadly. They required intervention to restore balance. The daily cycle of day and night was understood through the mythological narrative of Ra's journey. Ra, the sun god, sailed across the sky in his solar bark during the day, bringing light and life to the world. At sunset, he entered the underworld, the realm of the dead, and traveled through it during the night, facing various challenges and dangers. Most seriously, he had to battle Apophis, a massive chaos serpent who tried to swallow Ra and prevent the sunrise. Set, despite his association with chaos and disorder, actually helped Ra in these nightly battles, using his great strength to protect the sun god from Apophis. The sunrise each morning was thus not automatic. It represented Ra's victory over chaos, his successful journey through the underworld and return to the land of the living. Each new day was a rebirth, a renewal, a recreation of the world. This wasn't just poetic imagery. It was how Egyptians understood reality. When the sun rose, the world truly was renewed. Human sleep paralleled this divine journey. When people slept, their BA traveled through spiritual realms, facing dangers and receiving experiences. Awakening in the morning was a personal resurrection, parallel to Ra's daily rebirth. The proper sleep positions, the protective rituals, the amulets and spells, all of these were ways of ensuring that the individual's nightly journey would be successful, that they would return safely to waking consciousness just as Ra returned from the underworld to bring dawn. This is why the Osirian pose was so important for sleep. Osiris had died and been resurrected. He had traversed the boundary between life and death and returned, albeit transformed. By sleeping in the position of Osiris, people were connecting themselves to this mythology of death and rebirth, invoking divine protection for their own nightly journey through sleep's small death. The alignment of beds along the north-south axis connected to similar cosmic thinking. The North Star, which didn't move while other stars circled it, represented stability and permanence. It was sometimes associated with the imperishable stars, souls of the dead who had successfully completed their transformation and now lived eternally in the sky. By orienting yourself toward the North Star during sleep, you were aligning with that eternal stability, anchoring yourself against the chaos that threatened during sleep's journey. The gods associated with sleep, dreams, and night each played specific roles in maintaining Ma'at during the dangerous hours of darkness. Thoth, in addition to his roles as scribe and wisdom god, was the moon god, ruling over the night as Ra ruled the day. Thoth's wisdom helped navigate the complexities and ambiguities of the night world. Dreams received through Thoth's favor were trustworthy sources of knowledge and guidance. Isis, the great mother goddess, offered protection to sleepers as she protected all who called upon her. Her magic was powerful enough to have resurrected Osiris, at least partially, and that same magic could protect vulnerable sleepers from spiritual dangers. Biz and Tauret, though less important in the grand cosmic scheme, were personal protectors, household gods who watched over the intimate spaces of daily life including beds and sleeping areas. Even Set, despite or perhaps because of his association with chaos and danger, had a role to play. Set represented forces that couldn't be eliminated but had to be channeled and controlled. His strength was necessary for fighting Apophis. His chaotic energy, properly directed, could break through obstacles and overcome enemies. But uncontrolled, unchanneled Set energy was dangerous. This is why positions or behaviors associated with Set during sleep might be avoided. You wanted to invoke his power when necessary but not invite his chaos into the vulnerable realm of sleep. The fundamental belief underlying all of this was that humans were part of a cosmic order that was constantly being maintained through divine action and human participation. Nothing was random. Everything connected. The position you slept in, the orientation of your bed, the amulets you placed under your headrest, these weren't trivial matters of personal preference. They were ways of aligning yourself with Ma'at, of playing your part in the cosmic drama that unfolded each day and night. This worldview is so foreign to most modern people that it requires real effort to appreciate. We tend to see sleep as a private, personal matter, a biological necessity that happens automatically if we're tired enough. We might believe in God or gods, but few of us believe that our sleeping position affects our spiritual safety or that malevolent spirits prowl the night looking for vulnerable souls to attack. We've been trained by science to look for materialist, mechanistic explanations for everything. But for the ancient Egyptians, and for pre-modern people generally, the supernatural was natural. The spiritual was real. The boundaries between physical and non-physical, between human and divine, between waking and dreaming, these were porous and negotiable rather than fixed and absolute. Living in such a world required constant attention to maintaining right relationships with spiritual forces and with the cosmic order generally. Sleep, as a vulnerable state, required special care. As we approach the end of our journey through the world of ancient Egyptian sleep, let's acknowledge what we don't know and probably never will know. Despite all the archaeological discoveries, all the translated texts, all the scholarly analysis, there are significant gaps in our understanding of Egyptian sleep practices and beliefs. We don't know exactly how the Tangut script was pronounced, and similarly we don't know exactly how much the average Egyptian person really believed in all the elaborate mythology and ritual surrounding sleep. Was it deeply held conviction for everyone, or was there a spectrum from true believers to skeptics, as there is in any society about religious matters? The sources we have come primarily from the educated elite and from religious contexts, which might not represent the full range of attitudes that existed. We don't know precisely how common various sleep problems were. Were insomnia and nightmares epidemic, or were they relatively rare? How much of the medical papyri's discussion of sleep disturbances reflects common complaints versus rare conditions that needed special treatment? The texts tell us treatments existed, but they don't give us epidemiological data about prevalence. We're uncertain about many details of how ordinary daily life worked. When did most people actually go to sleep and wake up? How much sleep were they getting on average? Did work schedules allow for adequate rest, or were most people chronically sleep-deprived? Did the divided sleep pattern, with an interval of wakefulness in the middle of the night, really characterize Egyptian sleep, or are we projecting findings from other pre-modern societies onto Egypt without solid evidence? The question of whether certain sleep positions were actually avoided, versus simply not being the preferred or recommended position, remains somewhat speculative. The absence of face-down or back sleeping positions in artistic depictions doesn't definitively prove they were forbidden or even considered bad. Artistic conventions tend to show idealized or symbolic representations rather than realistic documentation. People might have slept in various positions throughout the night, with the side-sleeping Osirian pose being how they positioned themselves when first lying down or how they were depicted in art, not necessarily how they slept all night long. The connection between Set and certain sleeping positions is particularly speculative. While we know Set was associated with chaos and with the left side of the body, and while we know the Egyptians were concerned about maintaining order and avoiding chaos, making the leap to therefore they avoided left-side sleeping involves interpretation and inference that goes beyond what the direct evidence tells us. It's plausible, it fits with what we know about Egyptian symbolism and concerns, but it's not proven fact. We also don't know how strictly any of these preferences were followed in practice. Religious and cultural ideals don't always match behavior. Many Catholics today use birth control despite church teachings against it. Many observant Jews in modern times have found ways to use electricity on the Sabbath through various workarounds. Similarly, ancient Egyptians might have known the ideal way to sleep according to religious teaching but might not have always followed it in practice, especially in the privacy of their own homes at night when no one was watching. The degree of variation across Egypt's long history and vast geography is another area of uncertainty. Egypt's civilization lasted for over 3 millennia and stretched along hundreds of miles of the Nile Valley, with outposts and influences extending even farther. Beliefs and practices certainly evolved and varied. What was true in Memphis during the Old Kingdom might have been quite different from what was true in Thebes during the New Kingdom. Regional variations probably existed as well. But our evidence is scattered and uneven, making it hard to trace these changes and variations systematically. Despite these gaps and uncertainties, the picture that emerges is still fascinating and informative. The ancient Egyptians clearly did think deeply about sleep, did have preferences and concerns about how it should be practiced, did connect it to their broader religious and cosmological beliefs. They invented or developed tools specifically for sleep, from the distinctive headrests to protective amulets designed for nighttime use. They built temples where people could seek healing and prophetic dreams. They included sleeping equipment in tombs, showing they believed it would be needed in the afterlife. The attention they paid to sleep, the seriousness with which they treated it, offers a sharp contrast to modern society's tendency to undervalue sleep, to treat it as a waste of time that we should minimize to maximize productivity. The ancient Egyptians understood, in their own framework, something that modern sleep research has confirmed. Sleep is essential, not optional. It's a time of vulnerability that requires protection. It's a process that can be disrupted by physical and psychological factors. It's a state that affects health, well-being, and functioning during waking hours. There's something deeply appealing about the Egyptian approach to sleep, even for those of us who don't share their supernatural beliefs. The ritual of preparing for sleep, the deliberate transition from day to night activities, the creation of a protected, peaceful sleeping environment, these are practices that modern sleep hygiene recommendations echo in secular language. We might not believe we need protection from evil spirits, but we do know that a cluttered, chaotic bedroom makes for worse sleep than a calm, organized one. We might not believe in the spiritual significance of sleeping positions, but we do know that some positions are better for spinal alignment, breathing, and overall sleep quality than others. The Egyptian understanding that sleep required care and attention, that it wasn't something to be taken for granted or treated carelessly, is perhaps the most valuable lesson we can take from their practices. In our world of artificial light, stimulating electronic devices, demanding work schedules, and cultural glorification of sleeplessness as a sign of productivity and dedication, we've lost much of the reverence for sleep that characterized ancient societies. Rediscovering that reverence, even in a modified modern form, might be exactly what many of us need. As you continue to drift towards sleep, let the story of ancient Egyptian sleep practices settle in your mind like dust settling after a wind, gentle and gradual and natural. Imagine yourself in that distant world, lying on a woven mat or wooden bed frame, head resting on a curved wooden headrest that feels strange at first but somehow right, the scent of myrrh incense lingering in the air, mixing with the cooler scent of the evening breeze, the cool night breeze carrying distant sounds of the Nile, water lapping against the banks, night birds calling, perhaps the distant murmur of voices from neighboring houses settling in for the night. Imagine the comfort of knowing you're positioned correctly according to ancient wisdom, that you've followed all the proper rituals passed down through generations. There's a deep psychological comfort in ritual, in knowing you've done everything right, everything that should be done. You've burned the incense to purify the space. You've placed your protective amulets where they need to be. You've positioned your body in the Osirian pose, right side down, arms crossed gently over your chest, not gripping but resting. Your head points north toward the eternal pole star. Everything is aligned. Everything is as it should be. This sense of order and rightness helps the mind release its grip on the day's concerns. Imagine believing that your dreams might carry messages from gods, that the position of your body affects your spiritual safety during the vulnerable hours of sleep, that awakening in the morning is a daily resurrection paralleling the sun god's victory over chaos, a personal triumph over the small death of sleep. There's something powerful in that belief, something that makes sleep feel significant rather than mundane, sacred rather than merely necessary. Even if you don't believe it literally, even if your modern scientific mind knows that dreams are neural activity and position is about comfort and spinal alignment, there's still something appealing about treating sleep with such reverence. You don't have to believe any of it literally to find peace in the imagery, in the sense of being part of ancient human patterns that stretch back thousands of years, connecting you to a vast river of human experience. When you lie down to sleep, you're doing what humans have done for hundreds of thousands of years, what your ancestors did, what your descendants will do. The ancient Egyptians had their particular way of understanding and approaching it, with their gods and rituals and carefully crafted headrests, with their beliefs about the Ba and Ka, with their elaborate mythology of death and rebirth. But the fundamental experience of letting go, of surrendering to sleep's embrace, of trusting that you'll wake again in the morning, this is universal across time and space. This connects you to every human who has ever lived, every human who has ever closed their eyes and allowed consciousness to slip away into dreams. The recognition that people thousands of years ago struggled with the same challenges of seeking restful sleep that we face today is oddly comforting. They worried about nightmares just as we do. They tossed and turned on difficult nights. They woke too early and couldn't fall back asleep. They developed strategies for improving their sleep, different strategies than we use, shaped by their different understanding of reality, but serving the same fundamental purpose. Their solutions were different from ours, shaped by their different understanding of reality, but the fundamental needs were the same, the timeless human needs for rest, renewal, safety, peaceful dreams, the strength to face another day with its challenges and opportunities. The ancient Egyptians built one of history's greatest civilizations and sustained it for millennia, through countless generations of building and rebuilding, through periods of strength and periods of chaos, through foreign invasions and internal strife. They left monuments that still awe us thousands of years later, structures so massive and so precisely constructed that they seem almost impossible achievements for a people working with bronze tools and human muscle power. They developed sophisticated knowledge in architecture, engineering, art, medicine, and statecraft, accumulating wisdom over centuries and passing it down through carefully trained scribes and priests. And they did all of this while taking sleep seriously, treating it as a crucial activity deserving care and ritual rather than as an inconvenience to be minimized or dismissed. Perhaps there's a connection between respecting the rhythms of rest and building things that last, between honoring the natural cycles of activity and repose and creating achievements that endure across vast stretches of time. If you've enjoyed this journey back to ancient Egypt, exploring the world of sleep as the Egyptians understood it, take a moment to like this video. It helps more people find these stories and supports the creation of more content like this. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you won't miss future explorations of historical mysteries and forgotten knowledge. Leave a comment sharing where you're listening from and whether you knew anything about Egyptian sleep practices before tonight. Your engagement helps build a community of people who find peace in history's mysteries. The bells and whistles of modern life will still be there tomorrow. The emails and messages will wait. The problems and stresses that filled your mind during the day will still exist in the morning, but they can rest now, just as you can rest. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let your muscles relax, releasing the tension they've been holding. Let your mind continue to wander gently through the images of ancient Egypt, through the temple courtyards at dusk, through the sleeping arrangements of pharaohs and farmers, through the realm of dreams where souls traveled and gods sent messages. Sleep, in the ancient Egyptian view, wasn't an absence or a nothing. It was a journey, an experience, a transformation. Each night you died a little death and each morning you were reborn. This understanding elevated sleep from mere biological necessity to spiritual practice, from wasted time to sacred time. Even if we translate their beliefs into modern psychological or neurological language, some of that sense of significance can remain. Sleep is when we process the day's experiences, when memories are consolidated, when the brain clears out accumulated toxins, when the body repairs and restores itself. It's not wasted time. It's necessary time. It deserves respect and protection. The ancient Egyptians built massive pyramids that have lasted for thousands of years, but every one of those builders needed sleep. The scribes who created beautiful hieroglyphic texts needed sleep. The priests who performed elaborate rituals needed sleep. The pharaohs who commanded armies and oversaw kingdoms needed sleep. Sleep was the great equalizer, required by peasants and rulers alike. No amount of power or wealth could eliminate the need for rest. No one was too important or too busy to sleep. We know more about sleep science than the ancient Egyptians did. We understand the role of neurotransmitters and brain waves. We can measure sleep stages and identify sleep disorders. We have medications and therapies they never dreamed of. But have we really improved on their understanding that sleep is important, that it requires care, that the environment and rituals surrounding sleep matter? In some ways, they were wiser than we are, precisely because they didn't take sleep for granted, didn't treat it as something to be hacked or minimized, didn't glorify sleeplessness as a badge of honor. As you finally release your grip on waking consciousness, as you allow yourself to slip into true sleep, you're doing something your ancestors have done for hundreds of thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians had their particular way of understanding and approaching it, with their gods and rituals and carefully crafted headrests. But the fundamental experience of letting go, of surrendering to sleep's embrace, of trusting that you'll wake again in the morning, this is universal. This connects you to every human who has ever lived. The Western Shia vanished but left fragments. The ancient Egyptians left much more, massive architectural achievements and thousands of texts, but even they are mostly gone, their civilization ended, their beliefs no longer held. But sleep remains. The need for rest, the experience of dreams, the daily cycle of waking and sleeping, these continue unchanged across the millennia. In this, at least, we're exactly the same as those ancient people sleeping along the Nile, positioning themselves carefully on their right sides, arms crossed over their chests, heads pointing north, protected by amulets and spells, hoping for peaceful dreams and safe awakening with the sunrise. Rest now. Your journey through the history of sleep has brought you to this moment of actual sleep. The ancient Egyptians would approve. You've prepared properly, settling into comfort, occupying your mind with stories that are interesting but not alarming, allowing gradual transition from waking to sleeping consciousness. You've created, in your own way, the conditions for good rest. The specifics are different: central heating instead of the cool night breeze of the desert, a soft pillow instead of a curved wooden headrest, electric lights turned off instead of oil lamps guttering out. But the essentials are the same: safety, comfort, quiet, and the willingness to let go. Sleep well, dream peacefully, and wake tomorrow refreshed, resurrected like Ra from his nightly journey through the underworld, renewed like the ancient Egyptians believed they were renewed each dawn. The mysteries of ancient sleep practices will still be here when you wake, and so will all the other mysteries of history, waiting patiently for your attention. But for now, they can wait. For now, there's only sleep, that ancient necessity, that nightly journey, that universal human experience that connects us across all boundaries of time and culture. Rest. Rest.